Um, and also live transcript. Okay. So yeah, Carlos, I think we could start admitting people from the room, the waiting room, and we can get started. And President Bronet, would you like to begin with your remarks?
I can. Thank you so much, Laura. Welcome, everybody, to this remarkable event put together with deep consideration for a positive future. I am the very, very proud president of Pratt. So to all of you here and for all the work that you do, thank you and congratulations. I will say today is just a tiny representation of the most amazing array of extraordinary professionals. I'm also so pleased to acknowledge our remarkable donors who are recognized and committed industry leaders. Venice Biennale Extract and Repair has been supported by the Steel Institute of New York, and we are joined today by Gary Higbee, Director of Industry Development at the Institute. A quick shout out to Gary, who I know from overlaps in many domains. We cannot thank you enough. The Pratt School of Architecture's participation in the Venice Biennale in 2021 has involved nearly 60 Pratt faculty with 4 projects of Exhaust, Extend, Exchange, and Exist, and today's discussion, Extract and Repair. And today's event is, as you can see, over Zoom, but it is also being broadcast in the physical space of the Siegel Gallery in Higgins Hall at the School of Architecture at Pratt. So to all of you sitting in the hall, hello. I'm imagining that it will get more filled up as the day goes on. But alongside a live projection of the Extract and Repair conversation, 4 screens are showing videos from each of the Pratt Venice Biennale project groups. It's truly an immersive environment using the challenges of this very moment to create an opportunity for explorations of new modes of embodied learning. So for today's discussion, we will be looking at 2 key sites that have core connections to Pratt Institute. First, as part of Crown Heights in Brooklyn, Weeksville is a historic African-American neighborhood and has had a long relationship to Pratt Institute since the 60s. I guess that's not so long. Jeffrey Hogrefe and Scott Ruff's Pratt Weeksville archive builds on this long-standing alliance and will open the morning session of methods and engagements. Second, Governor's Island is a site with a more recent ongoing connection to Pratt. A multi-year initiative is underway on the island with projects that respond to the climate crisis. And earlier this summer, Governor's Island called for establishing an educational and research institution to anchor a planned New York City Center for Climate Solutions on Governor's Island. We are actually leading at Pratt a consortium that's participating in this call. But maybe more significantly, the School of Architecture presciently predated this call, and work has been going on for years. We'll learn more about some of this work in Xenia, Adjoubei, and Superman's presentation on the project field, and apologies for making a mess of your names if I did. Pratt Institute has also been a partner for years in Design for Freedom, launched by Sharon Prince, also presenting today, after a 2017 conversation between Sharon Prince and the extraordinary Pratt professor, Bill Menking. Last November, Grace Farms and Pratt hosted a panel looking at the movement to ethically source materials. We'll learn more about this panel today. And another shout out for Sharon, who I met first as an honoree in Chicago for her significant work building Grace Farms with Sana, and then as a guest with Bill Menking as my great introducer. The commitment to how we build supply chains, what we do, who we do it with, and how we ethically consider conditions and origins is so critical. And today you will see here agendas that include a key argument of extract and repair, presenting that materials matter. Pratt has had a long history of pioneering material innovations and considerations. So please join us as we present to you Extract and Repair as reflective of pillars of our institution, which is deeply anchored in design excellence, rooted in environmental and social excellence and social justice, in global considerations of responsibility, in issues of care and access, of fairness and appropriate engagement. Thank you. Back to you, Laura.
Thank you so much. And now we'll have remarks from Dean Harriet Harris.
Thanks, Laura. I'm hoping everyone can hear me okay. No one looks too puzzled. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this morning, Friday morning, of course. Shows your commitment to working incredibly hard after a long week of teaching, no doubt. I just want to say a few words really to build on Frances's comments, that really for any architecture school that tries to develop and implement some kind of crisis curriculum, not separating the social from the ecological is critical really in defining what extractive geographies are. We talk about e-values a lot in architecture, and it's one of our, I think it's a sort of fetish project, because in many ways what we define as being the e-value, the embodied energy of any one construction component, principally focuses more on the production, the manufacturing of that material, not its extraction. And this is of course something that Grace Farm's Design for Freedom initiative is really trying to confront through all kinds of workshops that impact on policy, and you'll hear more about that later. But I think one of the perils of doing this, of course, is that you're not considering the embodied exploitation of materials of the people and the planet that in many ways surrender labor and resources into this, if you like, material extraction process. Is in many ways an abdication of our duties as architects, as custodians of the built environment. And in fact, of course, what we also fail to consider when we think of e-values is the post-building, the degradation, demolition, and in many ways a toxic demise of the materials once they've been manufactured but are no longer functioning as architecture. So architecture's extractivisms then are in a way our kind of collective refusal to exclusively repurpose what we have already extracted. If you look to our curriculum and our design briefs, in many cases within studios, we encourage students to just specify new materials and then in many ways perpetuate this extraction economy, and even what one might argue ideology. And what comes with that, of course, is a denial of the fact that we are enacting a form of embodied energy injustice on the planet and the people. And it also reveals, I think, to some extent, the ways in which the machinery of colonialism, imperialism is still incredibly active. So when we were first invited to join the 17th Venice Architecture Biennale by Tom Kovac, who is the curator of the Italian Virtual Pavilion, we convened scholars from across Pratt 6 schools, partly because we believe fundamentally that even disciplines in many ways are colonial imperialist constructs. And if we are going to be serious about any kind of climate solution to the many problems that we have singularly created, then we need to start moving beyond notions of disciplinary silos and binaries. And I think that what we've revealed insofar with the exhibition that we held in May, and that's online, and certainly you can see more of that later if you haven't already, is that all of these, there are various, if you like, components related to extraction and repair that are in many ways interdependent and codependent. So we started off, of course, looking at exhaust projects that explored alternative materials, currency and energy, extending the notion of extend, what projects on urban, that looked at projects on urban natures and cyborg cities. We looked at exchange, the projects on, we showed projects on ecological narratives and environmental transparency, and then of course notions of what it is to exist, this idea of actually not making human architectures the preeminent architecture, but exploring notions of multi-species and cohabitation architecture. And then of course, extract and repair, which is in many ways our concluding symposium, but in fact this is also, and you'll hear more about this later, the prototype conversation for our Architecture Humanities Research Association conference in fall 22, and we'll invite you to that later. There'll be various things posted in the chat throughout the day. We're very interested in understanding what is the material constitution of indigeneity, because of course we talk about Global South and its relationship to extractive geographies, but not in a very precise or meaningful way, and certainly not relevant to policies, international policies that could protect the processes and confront the exploitations that take place as part of extractive geographic processes. So the shared aim perhaps today is to look at the ways in which architecture's actions and inactions both succeed and also fail to address the relationship between climate crisis and social justice. I suppose what we have as an opportunity is to think about the ways in which we can, through a contention of the transboundary harms of extractivism and supply chain exploitation, contemplate repair, but only if we acknowledge the ways in which this translocal materiality plays a key role in the fight for equality, freedom for all, and international democracy. So to some extent, and to conclude, this is the professional and the pedagogic mandate that each speaker and also each attendee carries today through the workshops, the presentations, and obviously the discourse in the chat and live questions. And I'd now like to hand over to our wonderful sponsor, Gary Higbee, the Director of Industry and Development at the Steel Institute of New York, to say a few words. But just to say, as the sponsor, the Steel Industry of New York is a not-for-profit association created in 1972 and actually serves to advance interests of steel in the construction industry. It also sponsors programs to aid developers, architects, engineers, and construction managers in using structural steel for buildings and structures, and not at all an antithesis to discussions about steel today. You'll be interested to know, and this is a contention from one of our keynotes, Kiel Moe, who you'll hear from later, that steel is in fact the most recycled material in the world, with about 98% of it avoiding landfills. So thank you, Gary, for avoiding landfills and for sponsoring our event. Over to you.
I think Gary is just going to be joining us in the audience today.
Jolly good.
Yeah,
Thanks, Gary.
A couple of words. So thank you. And I will move in.
I'll interrupt just to say,
yeah,
I wasn't prepared to leave you with any remarks, only because if I were a student, I would want to get right on with the program. And after Frances and you introduced the discussion, I think a third party is not necessary. Let me just say, we were very pleased to host a lecture series with Pratt over probably the last decade. We stopped for a couple of years, and re-engaging has been very good for us. So we look forward to more of these programs during the course of the year.
Yeah, exactly, Gary. I think Frances and I are the Statler and Waldorf Muppet Show style of the intro, and now to the hard matter that we're here to discuss. So thank you. Appreciate your support.
Thank you so much. So I can begin just to open, to continue the introductions. I'll share my screen. All right, so thank you to all participants, and also wanted to thank Assistant Dean Killian Riano and the team at City X Venice, and also Carlos Balza Giardino for the conversation today. And of course, Gary Higbee and his support. So when thinking about how to begin extract plus repair, I thought of perhaps showing images of flooded cities, of the storm a couple of months back in September here in New York City, of a flooded St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, of Hurricane Sandy exactly 9 years ago today on October 29th, 2012, and of flooded agricultural fields in rural areas around the globe, leading to crop failures and increased rates of food insecurity. But then I thought, we know these images. We have been living through these images as they happen with an increased frequency and result in various forms of loss. The loss of lives, both human and non-human, the loss of homes, the loss of entire cities, and even at a larger scale regions, and the potential irrevocable loss of a future within the lifetime of humans living today. Over the last year in particular, civilization-ending climate crisis seems to be increasingly represented as inevitable, as a fait accompli, across various forms of culture. We are quite potentially reaching an end on a massive scale that is painfully impossible to comprehend. And yet, as we learned from the most recent IPCC report, while there is a certain amount of warming we cannot avoid, we do not need to accept an uninhabitable planet as our future. Instead, what if we reject the fait accompli and the idea that our Earth will be increasingly unable to support life, but look to a different type of end? Here, I am thinking of the end of a period of extraction that we can trace back to 1600, with the formation of the first East India Company. The envisioning of this end is how I would like to begin Extract and Repair, and is, for me, the premise for bringing together the projects we are collectively discussing today. What does it mean to envision this end? The East India Company used raw materials to produce profit, with wealth extracted from colonies in a spatial set of relationships, from the plantation to the railway or road, to ports, to ships that sailed to ports in the metropole, where such materials were processed in factories and then transported to market. Our current global supply chain uses this colonial network, in many instances, repurposing colonial sites for neo-colonial processes of extraction. And this is a photograph I took in Sri Lanka a number of years back, and was really interested to see that in this port in Colombo, the administrative building is a colonial building, and then you have the contemporary port in this exact same space. The transformation of raw materials into goods that could be sold relied on forced labor and a relentless pace of work. Long before the pandemic, there were fissures in this system. We can think back to the 1999 WTO protests in Seattle as an act of resistance to the contemporary global supply chain. But with the combination of the pandemic and climate crisis, the question of how long this system can last has become an everyday concern. And so we can turn again to this question of what it means to envision the end of the extractive logic of the last 400 plus years, and what it means to repair or mend what we can in a refusal of the end we are being asked to accept. So I think we can actually move into actually begin our first panel for the day. Jeffrey and Scott, if you want to begin. The day is structured into 3 parts. We have a panel in the morning that we're beginning now, and that is focused on methods and engagements. And then we'll move into the keynote, and then a second panel in the afternoon that's focused on materials and ecologies. And just in the interest of time, I will put bios of speakers in the chat as they begin speaking. Just so maybe sharing Gary Higbee's sentiment of sort of getting right to the heart of matters. Again, thank you so much to all here, and really delighted to begin the first session with Jeffrey and Scott's presentation.
Okay, thank you, Laura. And thank you, President Bronet and Dean Harris and Kilian Riano for organizing this event. And before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're sitting in Brooklyn on unceded land of the Lenape people in Lenapehoking, and that the Lenape people have lost all recourse to reclaiming their land from the US government, forcing them to live in a state of perpetual statelessness. And that's going to weave into our talk today, because we do work with areas that were formerly Lenape territory, but we're dealing specifically with the 200-year history of slavery in Brooklyn and the results of formerly enslaved people forming the Weeksville community in the 19th century. And the question that we're asking, larger question, is if the African-American experience emerges from the structure of slavery, what does architecture, whose main purpose is to fortify the state, have to say to that experience? And while I acknowledge that Vitruvius's directive on architecture's role in fortifying the state may seem to apply to an earlier era, the much more recent expansion of public housing, the school to prison pipeline, and neighborhood gentrification today challenge architecture to examine its role in fortifying the state. At a time of renewal of violence toward people of color and an emerging aesthetics that privileges Blackness as a politics of transformation, African-American space is a world-making and shaping aesthetic and political operation that foregrounds the creative output of African-American people in the wake of state and extra-state oppression. At the core of African-American space is a political form of experience which can be expressed on sites that are appropriated from the status quo, resulting in communities of refuge, delight, and joy. They are environments that allow the Black community to thrive, that remedy centuries of precarity and enclosure. Taking the theme of extract and repair from today's symposium, we're looking specifically at extractive lives and the ways in which African-American space is exemplified in the Weeksville community in central Brooklyn. Our project, the Pratt Weeksville Archive, is seen as a reparative agent of empowerment in African-American space. You will hear many presentations today about materials. We're looking at the human materials that Catherine Yusuf refers to as a billion Black Anthropocenes, subjects that are caught between the hardening of geopolitical borders and the material de-stratification of territory. We are extracting the stories of those who have been silenced as a reparative act in countering the effects of a culture that diminishes, degrades, displaces, disenfranchises, and destroys Black lives.
Although generally associated with the South, U.S. slavery was legal in New York State for over 200 years, and slave ownership was only surpassed in number by South Carolina. When slavery was outlawed in New York State in 1827, a period of racial persecution led to the formation of self-supporting Black communities to mitigate the effects of anti-Black racism. Weeksville was founded in 1838 by formerly enslaved persons and freed persons in Brooklyn, New York, who wanted to own land so they could vote in elections. Only male property owners could vote in New York State at that time. Distinguished by its urbanity, size, and physical economic stability, Weeksville provided sanctuary for self-emancipated persons from Southern slave plantations and for free Black peoples escaping the violence of New York City's draft riots in 1863. Weeksville houses, in the heyday, the community supported at least 7 Black institutions, including the Freedmen's Torch, an African-American newspaper, since enslaved Africans were prohibited from learning how to read. The second African-American community in the US was eventually absorbed by the forces of anti-Black racism that undergirded real estate development in New York City. Collective memory has kept this history alive. After almost 50 years of community-led persistence and vision, in 2014, the Weeksville Heritage Center opened on the original footprint of the historic campus to preserve the history and provide an exhibition space and interpretive landscape. And here, if I can advance slides, here's an image of Weeksville as it is located within Brooklyn. And we also have an image here of approximately late 1960s, early 1970s image of the Weeksville houses which were preserved.
The Pratt Weeksville Archive opens the archive of the Weeksville Heritage Center to locate the collective memory among existing community members and students in a school of architecture. This paper argues that historic Black 19th century self-supporting communities can provide a model of empowerment for 21st century Black communities. The ghost of Weeksville is calling from the past in central Brooklyn, the largest African-American community in the US, with a population that is shrinking in numbers due to the trauma of displacement that Mindy Fullilove characterizes as root shock, the crippling effect of decades of disinvestment in communities of color and the urban renewal practices that destroyed those communities. Neighborhood gentrification resulting in the forced displacement of people who have become apolitical, lacking a sense of place, ahistorical, lacking a sense of past, and afuturistic, lacking a sense of purpose, leads to the further destruction of a historic Black community for affluent new residents who lack the appreciation of the community.
Our project arose out of research in African-American space for the anthology In Search of African-American Space, Redressing Racism. Weeksville is presented in 2 chapters by Elizabeth Kennedy and Sarah Caples and Everardo Jefferson. We approached the Weeksville Heritage Center with the idea of opening the archive through interviewing and storytelling with local residents who may have a connection with the historic community. We began with the Bethel Tabernacle AME Church, which predates Weeksville and regularly participates in Weeksville events. In richly narrated personal anecdotes, the interviews capture the everyday life of a tightly knit, self-organizing community that survives the effects of mounting anti-Black racism compounded by the COVID-19 pandemic. They reveal the value of a series of events that are conducted throughout each week and year to hold the community together in joy and delight of the role of mutual aid in delivering and maintaining social services such as food pantries, outreach for the elderly, voting registration, self-supporting community gardens, and combating gun violence to protect the young.
Great. Thank you, Scott. We incorporated our archival research in a research studio for 4th-year students who are interested in design on an urban scale in central Brooklyn. For students designing projects that engage directly with the issues of community development, the archive provides a resource of everyday practices in agriculture and mutual aid that can be traced to the record of the historic Weeksville. With the archive, students can access pre-existing interviews and reach out to prospective subjects for clarification of statements in the public domain. The community participants in the Oral History Archive are invited to attend the studio reviews and to participate in the community of the school. One of the interview subjects, pictured here, Ronald Johnson, commented that he never thought of Pratt Institute as interested in him or his life until he began to participate in the archive.
Here, we will begin to show a series of images from our studio. The studio sought to connect to the living archive of a self-supporting community for imagined and speculative futures on sites in central Brooklyn that would encourage new programs that provide a counterforce to neighborhood gentrification. We paired Mindy Thompson Fullilove's Root Shock, How Tearing Up City Neighborhoods Hurts America, and What We Can Do About It, with Kevin Lynch's Image of the City, to interrogate the foundational text in urban mapping from a decolonial perspective and introduce the theory of root shock through displacement in their analysis of the sites. Students noted the sites of displacement in their mapped areas, i.e. NYCHA housing blocks, vacant lots, warehouse housing, and created a glossary of terms that they used to describe the effects of root shock in their mapping operations. Again, one of the processes was a collage that we used, and here are a few set of images that started to show the visual results of their research. Jeffrey.
Thank you, Scott. Research revealed a number of material sources from which an understanding of African-American space can be based, such as landscape, slave gardens, agricultural practices, building construction, music, basket weaving, quilt making, spirituality, feminism, and an alternative politics, which each student pairing studied and analyzed as a chosen artifact or process. Through the understanding of its scale, dimensions, and tectonics, the artifact or process was translated to explain its structure, composition, modes of assembly, disassembly, component materials, and relationship with the body, an analysis of time-based processes, and the structure of the form of narratives emerging from African-American space. The emphasis of the project was placed on translating the artifact process of analysis into a performative and composite drawing able to capture and distill its syntax and tectonics through various forms of experimentation that would include collage, superimposition, and automatic writing to reveal the uncanny forces. We began with a discursive studio and studied text in the Black feminism of the last 30 or 40 years, including Christina Sharp and Saidiya Hartman, and really found a way to move these important texts into a design of an architecture project.
Connecting to the archive opens the archive to community members and students who can participate in a historic Black community that is still relatively unknown and provides a valuable resource for an engaged design studio. For historic documents and photographs, we have observed that the Weeksville community of the 19th century covered a significant amount of land in central Brooklyn. Yet, we don't have an accurate map of the community. As such, the archive has the capacity to locate buried collective memory of a significant cultural development that may act as a counterforce to the economies that destroy Black life, since it instills a sense of pride of the past among the participants and residents. In conclusion, the Pratt Weeksville Archive strengthens community development by creating a continuity that doesn't exist among the rapidly changing economies of central Brooklyn. This takes place through several processes that center around the ongoing development of archival and oral history and critical ethnography collections held by the Weeksville Heritage Center. It demonstrates how critical ethnography applied to architecture can contribute to conceptualizing and bringing about a more diverse, just, and equitable society. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And we'll move now to Jerrod Delaine. And I'll again post in bio in the chat. And the idea for today is in these panels that we'll have a series of presentations. They're each 15 minutes each. And then we'll have a conversation after the presentations are done. Jerrod, do you want to?
Hi there. Can you give me the ability to share screen?
Yes, you're the co-host now.
Perfect. You can see my screen now?
Yep, that's great.
Wonderful. Good morning, everybody. My name is Jerrod Delaine. I bring greetings from the Desegregation Think Tank and the Housing Consortium, a collection of architects and designers and planners and a few developers here at the Pratt School of Architecture. I'm here today to talk to you about designing equity. Little bit of the format, I'll give you a little bit of an introduction. We'll discuss some problems, and more importantly, we'll discuss some solutions. A small case study and conclusion at the end. So, the challenge of today's presentation is, what should the design and building industry do to create more diverse, more healthy, more enjoyable, and more economically viable communities? Designers have a way to do that. And today I'd like to talk about some of those tools, some of those initiatives, some things that have been successful, some things that have not, so that both, designers as well as students can learn some best practices and how we can make communities better. So, the title of this event is,
I think you just went on mute.
okay, can you hear me now?
Yep.
All right. So first, what is equity, right? So according to Investopedia, equity is referred to as shareholders' equity. It is a shareholder's position, and in technical terms, it's the shareholders' equity as it's the total assets minus liabilities, right? Assets minus liabilities. It is the the value that is a certain participant's stake. So first, the difference between equity and equality, right? So the first example and the last example here, I think is a great example. The first example is a city deciding to cut budgets across the board for all schools. It won't have the same impact, right? Some schools, some students, don't have the same resources and connections, that the losses will actually impact them in a greater extent. For example, when COVID started and we all had to work from home, not everybody had high-speed internet at home. Not everybody had an iPad or a computer that they could use at home and still perform and excel and continue to participate, right? An example of equity is a city determining, specifically which times and hours that a community actually needs. That is much more pinpointed, that it's not across the board. The last example here I like is great as well. An example of equality is all schools in the community have computer labs with the same amount of hours, but equity is, labs in lower income communities having more printers, more computers, and longer hours that maybe some of their participants need because they have different working hours, right? That is not a one size fits all type solution. And I think that's, what equity is about, being thoughtful about how can we help others, how can we be productive for others. So let's talk about some problems, right? So as we all know, in America, we've had this thing called, urban decay, urban disinvestment, whatever you want to call it, that this idea of moving out to suburbia was kind of the aspiration. It was the quote unquote American dream, right? Was to move out to a beautiful community with a beautiful house and a beautiful yard and government subsidized mortgage. Part of this was incentivized by the Title I Housing Act of 1949, which focused specifically on urban redevelopment. So large amounts of federal money was used to do what they called slum clearance, right? So they destroyed some buildings, created new buildings. You think of in New York City, you think of things like Lincoln Center, where they have these beautiful, edifices today, but, people's houses were there before. And that, those people weren't, provided equity in exchange for that trade-off, right? So entire neighborhoods were demolished. In many cases, new highways, new infrastructure, above ground trains were put in place that had some negative effects, both fiscally as well as health-wise on those in those communities, right? Title II of that Housing Act guaranteed loans for mortgages through government underwriting, right? So the government said, listen, we will provide loans, which is, help incentivize what we know as suburbia. So you can get a single family house. It'll be, the same cost or cheaper than what you're spending in the city, and you'll get to a beautiful community with good schools and good quality of life, right? At the same time, as we all know, There were redlining practices that happened that excluded certain uses. So uses that were harmful weren't allowed, as well as minorities were often uninvited and not allowed to receive mortgages in those communities, right? As a result, those that remained in urban communities started to see disinvestment, started to see discrimination practices, the property values started to drop. It was harder to get a mortgage, you know, as well as a number of other terrible things, right? So the Housing Act provided, you know, funds for FHA, which also created public housing in the country. So we have this large collection of housing stock that starts to get built around the country. A lot of it is actually in New York City. So a fun fact, about 25% of all public housing in America is located in NYCHA in New York City. So we have a very big vested interest in this housing stock and how we treat it going forward. During this time period, architectural styles started to change as well. You know, the early, you know, forms of public housing had more of a garden style, low scale with yards, front yards and backyards in many cases, even like, you know, clothes hanging racks in the backyard, that you actually had space where kids can come out and play. But as the years go on, you know, you get to the 1950s and the Le Corbusier method of architecture becomes popular. This new idea of the future cities, which I'm a big Mies van der Rohe fan, but public housing started to take on this design style. And part of the idea was envisioning a skyline that was dominated by, you know, high rises and tall buildings. But, you know, as time would go on, you know, these high rises actually ended up becoming these gigantic disasters that have not been sustainable to support over time, and without government support has actually been quite dangerous in many cases to those who live in the neighborhood as well as those in the surrounding neighborhoods. Also in the 1950s, you know, the US economy started shifting from more of a goods and producing economy, making stuff, to much more of a service producing economy. So we went from making stuff to having more knowledge work. So people are starting to work in finance. People are starting to get business degrees. People are learning how to, you know, provide a service and provide a living versus, you know, the previous 50, you know, plus or minus years, you know, the industrial age had a very good run where you could, you know, have one breadwinner who could provide a home for the spouse and children, right? Jobs began to shift to more low-waging jobs as well as high-waging jobs. So you start to get this kind of gap in folks that make lots and lots and lots of money, and then those who do not, right? So the middle class, which really grew, you know, coming out of the Great Depression in suburbia, we actually start to see this kind of separation. And at the same time, these urban communities were getting disinvested. You know, a big thing that happened in America is what we call white flight, which was the escape from cities and urban cores, from all the things that I just talked about, from the disinvestment, from the infrastructure, from the government not supporting, the government encouraging folks to move out to suburbia. You know, it was almost a sign of social status to move to larger communities, to move to a single family house. You know, I'm from Florida. You know, the whole thing when I was growing up was gated communities. That was somewhat of a social status. So Lyndon Johnson, you know, provided some space for civic leaders to really investigate what was happening as we were starting to create this suburbia thing. And then you have this kind of separation between, you know, the outer rims of the city and the city cores. And they created this report called the Printer Report. And in that report, they stated that, you know, our nation was moving toward two different societies, one in which Black people live in the urban cores, and one in which white folks lived in separate and unequal living accommodations, right? So this is decades ago that they stated that this is a problem, right? By the 1950s and 60s, inner cities started to be termed as ghettos. And that wasn't always initially considered a terrible thing or a bad thing. It was kind of like a transitional housing, situation that as time has gone on has gained negative connotations to them. Many of the public housing buildings started to encounter these massive social problems from lack of education, lack of infrastructure, bad social constructs, because of concentrated poverty. Again, like before the 1940s, 50s, we didn't really have this. We didn't have these super large blocks with incredibly high density with folks that may not have enough resources. This is kind of a new situation that designers, in part, help create. Other problems, environmental justice. The idea that your social construct can be affected by the government. There's been protests for years, decades, where folks have said, the environment that I live in, that I breathe in, I need protection. That has been an ongoing fight. That has been a problem, even till today, with the fracking industry. Again, inadequate government support has, been a problem. And even up till today, the Section 8 solution to housing, it hasn't really provided enough for those that need it. So let's talk about solutions, and I'll try to speed up. I have a few minutes left. I think we should go back to creating produce in our communities. It can provide not only, good and healthy food sources, but also economic benefit. And in particular, the cannabis industry, I believe, is going to be a big growth space that I think is going to create jobs, as well as health benefits going forward. Smart zoning, urban planners, for you young designers out there, you should help us create cities going forward. Soho NoHo rezoning is a great example of a community that's not that diverse, that is not economically diverse either, that, as it stands, is all zoned as industrial, which is crazy, right in the middle of one of the most expensive cities in America. It's essentially a gated community. We should be creating housing for young people. We should create, workspace for young artists. Our zoning policies currently aren't that flexible to help create that. Healthy buildings, the LEED certification, we all know it's very popular, that it helps, create sustainable buildings and how buildings are healthy for the environment. The WELL certification talks about how the building impacts us as human beings, right? So us as designers, we can create buildings that are better and healthy, the air we breathe, the water we consume. Green jobs can help address climate change. The future is, a space where we need to be much more aware of the environment, as we've learned as of late. We're having these 100-year rains all the time now. The environment is pushing back. And the federal government is starting to step up now to say, listen, we need to address this. Employment in that space is going to be a growth sector. Also, just being thoughtful in economic development. If you're building in a community, you should hire people in that community. If you're a designer designing in a community, talk to the youth in that neighborhood. What do they want to see in that community? I think I heard Scott say one time, we as architects, we should be advocates, right? We should help them accomplish what they want to see and what they envision in their neighborhood. We should assist them in that. So hiring locally, getting local expertise, designers and builders should be doing that going forward. And then, banking, there's so many new things out there that actually can make neighborhoods better. The Community Reinvestment Act, you should look it up. It forces banks to reinvest in communities where they bank, that they don't just take resources away. They should also encourage, small business loans. How do we help small business. We're talking about equity, right? How do we create small business in communities, right? And when those businesses get started, they're going to hire interns from that neighborhood, right? They're going to collaborate with other businesses in those neighborhoods. They're going to meet up in local coffee shops, right? And do business and shop and spend commerce in that neighborhood. Part of the disinvestment in communities is that you couldn't have a business in these neighborhoods. You couldn't get a loan from the bank. Your job was a far commute. Luckily with technology, you can kind of sort of work from anywhere. And here in this photo behind here is a photo of the Capital One Bank, which is, you know, reevaluating how we use banking centers, that it could be a place where you can come and meet, come and have coffee, come and get some work done. I think fintech is a growing space. We should be encouraging young people to get involved. I'm a little old. I don't really know how Bitcoin works, but for young folks, that is a space where there's growth going on, and they can participate in the new economy. These banks should provide mortgages in neighborhoods. People should enjoy the economic improvement of their neighborhood. You know, you're planting that garden, you're cleaning up the streets, you know, you're going to the PTA meeting. You should enjoy the economic benefit of that neighborhood. So lenders in those neighborhoods, builders should provide options for that. And just quickly, Common Ground is a great case study where there's a different type of equity. So there's a cooperative community where they built a community where those who live in that community, you know, they can enjoy the fact that, you know, their housing, their workspace is also economically viable, as well as it has a carbon neutral footprint, that it can be done. You know, designers just need to put a little thought into it. Here's kind of an example of some of the ways that they're creating a sustainable community, again, that is also equitably viable to them. But they're not just living there, but there's also some economic benefit in participating and being in that environment. So in closing, you know, thank you, everybody. I believe that it just takes a little more thought, that we can create really compelling architecture, really compelling buildings that make communities better. And I truly believe that, you know, we all should be doing that going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now we'll move into a presentation from Galen Pardee, and shifting to geographically. So yeah, Galen, do you want to get started?
Sure, thanks.
I need to unshare. Give me.
Okay, can everybody see my screen okay?
Yep.
Great, awesome. Well, first of all, yeah, thanks so much for having me. This is really exciting. And thanks to Jerrod, Scott, and Jeffrey for your presentations. It was a real privilege to see all the stuff that's going on. So yeah, as Laura said, I'm kind of shifting quite far from New York City here. I want to talk very quickly about this project, Territories of Territory Extraction, which has been an ongoing effort of mine over the past 4 years to sort of look at how tools of architectural representation, i.e. what we as architects technically produce in a very literal sense, can be turned into sort of tools of analysis and tools of sort of view finding, if you want to call it that, so that, you know, it's not kind of democratizing the way that we as architects see the city, and turning that into a sort of public resource. So I'll explain a bit more. I should say as I begin, Territories of Territory Extraction is actually on display as a partner program of the Chicago Architecture Biennial right now. Basically the exhibition, which you'll see some photos from throughout here, basically explores the path to single material, sand, and its role in literally constructing the city and politics of the modern Singaporean city-state. Singapore, unlike almost any other nation on earth, actually is sort of obligated to import all of its construction-grade sand from overseas rather than mine it domestically. So this creates an opportunity for analysis because the trade network for this material is actually gigantic. It covers most of Southeast Asia. So this kind of presented an opportunity to sort of get in and sort of get under the hood, if you will, and start to see what was under there. This sort of scale also kind of heightens some of the contradictions between the sort of murky, sort of quasi-legal conditions in places where sand is extracted, and the sort of glossy, very high rent mega developments on the consuming side, Singapore. So what this project seeks to do, as I said before, is actually kind of use that sort of glossy, well-publicized, well-documented side of the supply chain to sort of create a viewfinder to see the other side, the sort of less easy to track, more diffuse, somewhat more informal sort of sand extraction zone. So just a note on the show, I partnered with a group in Chicago called Mass Context. You may have heard of, if not, they're great. They do a lot of books and publishing, and they run a journal. So in this reading room, the collected work of Territories of Territory Extraction to date is collated into a series of 12 volumes of text, photographs, and drawings on a custom fabricated table, surrounded by a 48-foot tapestry, which acts as a kind of table of contents for discrete lines of investigation. So I just want to take this moment to thank Iker Gill, Mass Context, for their support. And also to thank the Knowlton School of Architecture at Ohio State, which is where I was a fellow for many years, and also the Graham Foundation for their support of the project. So I'm going to get right into it. This is actually not Singapore. Some of you may know that. This is a small island called Nipa Island, which is actually just over the border, the maritime border between Indonesia and Singapore. And this island is actually what started this whole inquiry for me. As you can see in the slides, it's basically lived 3 lives. In 1990, it was the sort of maximum extent. By 2003, it had been shrunk to sort of like a very small sliver. And then by 2018, which is the image on the right, it's a little hard to read the text, that's its sort of current configuration. So what has happened is not necessarily rising seas, it's actually sand mining. So this island was essentially dredged almost completely out of existence. Indonesia banned sand exports to Singapore in the mid-2000s. But the island had degraded so much, and it was so close to the international boundary that if it had actually fallen beneath the high water mark, that boundary would have shifted. So Indonesia was kind of obligated to re-dredge its own island and sort of rebuild this territory. So what this gets to is the kind of ways in which, in this particular instance, architecture, geopolitics, and material economy all sort of start to overlap and entangle in one another. And it occurs to me that I think the geopolitical and ecological actors are probably well aware of their presence, whereas architects are probably less so. This is a map of Singapore in 1991. Nipa Island is called out down in the lower left. And this is Singapore today. So Singapore is undergoing, in addition to just building buildings and sort of expanding its skyline, it's also expanding its territory. It wants to grow by 30% by 2030. As you can see, we are about 20 years into that goal. Just to sort of hop back real quick, it's been pretty good at what it's doing. Most of the expansion is concentrated on the southern and eastern coastlines. These are all sort of largely industrial zones, and it's all built on sand that Singapore has imported from someplace or another. So why sand? It's important to note at this juncture that construction grade sand is actually distinct and non-renewable. So there are 2 kinds of sand, roughly speaking, in the world. There are the sort of sand that you find in a desert, which is formed by the action of wind sort of moving across the surface. And there's sand formed by water. Sand formed by water is what we would call construction grade sand. It leaves granules that are more irregular and bind better together just in a sandcastle or in concrete. So that means if you have access to a riverbed, if you have access to the ocean floor, or if you have access to a dried up lake, you have access to construction grade sand. Of course, not everybody has that access, as Singapore proves. So this is a sort of early attempt at what the sort of process I was talking about earlier, trying to draw the scale of this industry. So a UN report indicated that in 2012, if you sort of combined all of the gravel and sand that had been extracted worldwide, you would get a wall the circumference of the Earth, 27 meters high by 27 meters tall. So this is a representation of that structure kind of circumnavigating downtown Singapore. Singapore is also of interest in this sort of sand geography because so much of its architecture is actually made of concrete. You might think, given that it has to import all of these, all the sand it uses, that there might have been a shift in the industry towards steel or mass timber or literally anything else, but there actually hasn't been. And that's because these sort of ripple effects of this kind of material logistical process, they go in both directions. So it's not just that architects are sort of specifying concrete buildings, it's that the construction industry and also the government bureaucracies that control building codes have sort of the inertia of using concrete has led to those sort of institutions preferring concrete. So an example of this, and this is just a sort of generic construction site in Singapore. Most construction workers in Singapore are actually on visas. They're from overseas, other countries in Southeast Asia, and those visas are for 2 years only. So a contractor in Singapore faces a choice. You can either sort of revert to precast, cast in place concrete, which is pretty easy to teach somebody how to do, or you can spend valuable time in that 2 years that you have a construction worker, teach them to weld, teach them to work with mass timber, teaching them to do these other processes. So in many cases, it's precast and cast in place concrete is really the only way for the construction industry to produce buildings at the scale required by the master plans that the city puts out. And so one last point before I get into drawings for real is this kind of question of data. So again, the issue here is that the sand mining sources are actually super diffused and also quite hard to track. So this is a graph of what Singapore says it has imported and from where, basically back to 1989. If you were to flip this around and look at this graph from the perspective of, say, Indonesia or Malaysia, the dark blue and the dark green in this image, their totals might be 80 times higher, and it varies drastically year over year. All of these countries have also imposed bans on trading sand to Singapore. The red lines show those time periods with sometimes negligible effects. If you think back to that comparison, Singapore has grown pretty constantly over the past 18 years. And there have been 5 bans on sand imports in that time frame. So clearly there's a black market. The sand bans aren't as effective as people say they are. Something is happening that can't be resolved by just looking at data. So I'll just get into it. This is a map of Singapore. I'm going to show you guys 3 sort of attempts to sort of forensically redraw the city of Singapore, looking for different aspects of the sand trade. So let's get into it. So the first is called stockpile forensics. As the title suggests, this is about stockpiles. So just as we in America have the Federal Reserve, which sort of is the backstop for our currency, Singapore's government has actually created sand stockpiles. There's 3 of them. They are these giant sand dunes. They're pretty dumb as far as infrastructure goes. They're literally just piles of sand, but they are controlled by the government. The sites are secured and sort of dewatered and under surveillance, which basically allows the government to sell sand directly to contractors if and when a nation imposes a ban or the supply chain breaks down, and basically kind of float the construction industry until another trading partner is established. So again, these are the 3 sites. I was interested in trying to unpack using both kind of like satellite data and also on-site observations from a field study trip in Singapore, basically trying to like fill in the gaps. As I said, these are highly secured sites. The government doesn't release information on how much sand is in the strategic reserve or when to access it. You can't really even get into the strategic reserves. So these are a kind of sequence of using satellite data, kind of taking sort of key moments in time and trying to color code and index basically who the likely source of sand was in a given year, and sort of figure out where these things came from and when. And basically what I found after doing this is that each of the sort of major sand bans that came into effect actually preceded the construction of a stockpile. So for instance, the upper left is the first stockpile that was started. It's called Tampines. And that was started when Malaysia banned sand exports to Singapore in the late 90s, which was the first time this had happened and was kind of a big shock to the construction sector. So when you take those sort of very rough abstract models and you sort of perform a like photogrammetry analysis, you can actually create something that's a little more realistic and actually scaled. So these are actually 3D models of the 3 sites. From moving from left to right, you have Tampines, Punggol, and Seletar. And again, this is not a scientific analysis, I would say. I mean, you know, this is all based on photogrammetry and satellite data. But under these conditions, we can estimate that Tampines holds about 6.45 million cubic meters of sand. Punggol holds 3.58 million, and Seletar holds 7.78 million. So just to give you a reference, the amount of sand held in Tampines stockpile could cover all of Central Park in a sort of layer of sand 1 grain thick. So it's a really kind of staggering amount of material held in these sites. Obviously, that doesn't show the whole picture. There's a sort of, there's some layers missing. Those stockpiles are sort of point sources. So this second attempt is called Materials Ecologies. And what it attempts to do is actually sort of take a scene like this. This is workers constructing a polder on one of the reclamation sites in Singapore, and sort of deconstruct it, looking at it from the perspective of how a member of the public who's not a professional in the architecture or engineering construction industry would actually see this. This you know, starts to look at kind of what publicly available sources of visual data are available. These are captures from Google Earth. These are from commercial satellites. And when you start to dig into the sort of likely constitution of the shipping fleet that brings the sand to Singapore, you can start to arrive at some sort of relative propositions about how much embodied sand you're actually looking at when you see a picture of a dredger or a cargo vessel around Singapore these days. Of course, the downfall there is that that's reliant on a private satellite company producing an image that happens to line up with the things you're looking for on a given day, just as your photograph of a construction site is sort of when you happen to be there and doesn't have much relationship to when sand is being delivered or anything like that. So what I tried to do most recently with this project is actually sort of locate the sand borrow areas, which is a technical term for basically where on the seafloor you can send a dredger, you can suck up sand, and you can harvest it. For this, I actually used a sort of set of commercial ship tracking websites. Again, knowing roughly speaking who the players were, what kind of vessels we were looking for, what kind of dates. You can actually sort of locate them. So basically the sandbar areas are sort of off the coast of Malaysia as recently as February of last year. And the sort of shipping fleet is a mixture of sort of Belgian, Dutch, Chinese, Singaporean, basically like private conglomerates. And that's sort of what's active at the moment, finishing construction on the sort of last remaining reclamation sites. Again, you know, what sort of fell flat for me in this analysis was, you know, there's a lot of sort of background knowledge that needs to go into sort of understanding all of these ships that have been deployed. And also, again, it's highly based on when you're looking, when you're taking data, you know, it's very kind of like temporally specific. So that led me to the last sort of attempt here, which is called terraform chronologies. And again, what this was trying to do is actually sort of unpack one of these sites. This is a actual dredging site taken over the construction fence under the barbed wire, as you can see, and start to actually sort of create something that's a little more granular, maybe a little more live, and sort of unpack the sort of growth of the coastline as opposed to a specific building or a specific stockpile. So to do this, I relied on the Landsat program, which for those of you who don't know, Landsat is a program, satellite mission of the United States government. It's open source, or sorry, it's free. And it basically produces a complete image of the entire Earth's surface every 16 days in these kind of geostationary tiles. So you always know where to look. The tile size is actually sort of consistent. And the archive stretches back to the late 1970s. So you can really sort of mine this data for a lot of information. And I should say it's not only visual information, it's also dimensional. Each pixel in a Landsat tile is 30 meters by 30 meters. And it's also spectral, right? So if you wanted to produce any kind of spectral analysis using the UV bands of the satellite, you could also do that. So this is the tile that Singapore is in. And so the approach here is similar to the stockpiling approach. Basically, using a sort of custom-made digital drawing machine, I was able to sort of generate models of the coastline, cross-reference them with the United Nations trade statistics, and do that by year, and basically create site by site a sort of taxonomy of where the sand may have come from in each year per site. So what does that look like? There are 5 key reclamation sites, some of which you may know. For instance, Moshe Safdie's Marina Bay Sands, the 3 towers with the boat parked on top, was actually built on one of these reclaimed sites. And what's interesting for me in these images is that you're able to sort of see in the sort of splotches of color trade relationships. So each color is a different country. The 2 longest running sites here in this detail are Tuas Megaport, which is going to be the largest cargo terminal in the world when it's completed, and Changi Airport on the far right, which is, as the name might suggest, the airport in Singapore, which has been expanding over the past 30 years, kind of further and further out into the ocean. So in those 2 sites, you can see a sort of wide range of suppliers, as these kind of changing relationships come and go. Whereas a site like Jurong Petrochemical Facility, which is the image in the middle here, this is actually a sort of, again, hydrocarbon production facility that's on a man-made island. This was built in the course of like 14 years, so very, very quickly. And so you can see that in the sort of colors shown in the image. It's only from 2 suppliers. So I'll close with this. So territory is a territory extraction. Again, I want to be very clear, I'm not making any scientific claims here. It's really more about the ways in which drawings and drawing technology can actually sort of represent the scale and impact of these material flows upon the built environment in ways that are both natural and man-made. So Singapore, I should also acknowledge, I mean, this has a unique relationship to a specific material, but my feeling is as we enter an age of uncertainty, disparity, and scarcity, understanding the ways that architecture actually becomes entangled with instruments of capital and environmental justice can really kind of push the industry to start to question, how we as architects and professionals can act as activists, educators, and also innovators in a world where, maybe the act of building is becoming sort of morally compromised in certain scenarios. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. It's really wonderful to see now that we've had these 3 presentations, just to see shared questions that, I think will be really fascinating to discuss in our conversation. We can see how those sort of move through the day as threads as well. We have a video from Carl Zimring. So I'm going to play that video now. That's his presentation. And then we'll move into the conversation for this panel. So I will share my screen. Okay. I'll start with the volume down a little bit, and you can let me know if it needs to go up rather than potentially putting out very loud video.
Hello, I'm Carl Zimring. I'm a professor at Pratt's Department of Social Science and Cultural Studies. I regret that we can't be together in person today, but I'm grateful to contribute to our program. My contribution to the theme of our discussion is investigating the complexities of the circular economy using my training as an environmental historian. Contemporary earth and engineering concepts about sustainable resource extraction include terms such as S3M, meaning sustainable minerals, metals, and materials, and urban mining, finding metals in the discards of modern industrial cities rather than extracting ore from the earth. My research points to the conclusion that these themes have a long and successful history of returning large quantities of materials to industrial production from sources other than mines. However, the human and environmental cost of this work cannot be ignored, nor can we say that these efforts represent a truly closed circle of material flows, as industrial capitalism demands ever greater quantities of materials to be extracted from the earth, despite the work of these circular economy proponents. 4 of my books give examples that complicate the claims of circular economy proponents, and with the rest of my time, I'd like to briefly go through some of what I have found. So in my first book, Cash for Your Trash, Scrap Recycling in America, I documented the rise of the ferrous scrap industry as one that had thousands of firms doing more than $1 billion in sales in 1918. I should say more than $1 billion in 1918 dollars. This is a massive industry working to reclaim materials, particularly metals, half a century before recycling became associated with the modern environmental movement. This work was successful, and it was also dirty and dangerous, exposing the workers to hazards beyond those of most occupations in industrial society. Rusty metal could give tetanus. Explosions from gas tanks and other machinery could maim or even kill workers. The processing machinery, including shears to cut scrap metal, could also maim workers. By the mid-1960s, the workplace injury insurance premiums for scrap yards were on a par with those of the most dangerous sectors of the American industrial society: deep sea fishing, and yes, mining. The beverage companies responsible for the proliferation of cans and bottles littering the American landscape in the 1950s and 60s established the Keep America Beautiful trade organization. Since the 1960s, Keep America Beautiful has promoted recycling as an environmental ethic that places the burdens of dealing with the single-use disposable wastes created by this industry on individual consumers, rather than on the industries that designed and mass-produced the materials going to discard. In this way, the concept of recycling as an economic activity has been obscured by the new rhetoric of environmentalism. But contemporary recycling programs do not function unless markets are found for the collected materials. More communities are learning this in the wake of China restricting imports of post-consumer plastics in the year 2018. Recycling depends upon the work of scrap firms, and these firms only function when there is demand for the collected materials by producing industries. Recycling can convert highly priced materials such as metals from landfills and incinerators. but consumers putting cans and bottles in recycling bins are not changing the systems of production that demand drilling for more petroleum to manufacture more plastic. The work of recycling also exposes social inequalities. These inequalities are evident in societies around the world, as social scientists who work on histories of waste management in South Asia and Brazil have established. In my book, Clean and White, A History of Environmental Racism in the United States, I note that from the late 19th century, the people who have performed this work in American communities were and are primarily not native-born white Americans. This pattern holds in all regions of the country, in rural as well as urban and suburban areas. The pattern also extends to other sanitation-focused work, such as garbage hauling and laundry. Furthermore, the places where scrap businesses and other waste-related businesses have been situated have historically been in communities that are majority Black and Brown in residential population. Again, from my research, as well as related work by fellow historians such as Sylvia Hood Washington and Andrew Hurley, the pattern of where these types of businesses were located was evident in American cities several decades before the rise of the environmental justice movement in the 1980s. In Clean and White, I argue that consciousness about racism in sanitary industries informed worker resistance movements in different times and different places. These include Atlanta washerwomen going on strike in the late 19th century, as well as Black male garbage workers striking in Memphis in 1968, in a movement that is most famous for being the final campaign of Dr. Martin Luther King's life. In the United States, as in other countries, the process of returning materials to industrial production exacerbates social inequalities as it increases body burdens through the dangerous and dirty work required to return materials to industrial production. If I have complicated our understandings of the circular economy, I can also point to historical evidence of some success stories in industrial strategies to reclaim discards. The work of industrial designers to engage with the circular economy is important to consider, as choices made in the design stage of a product have major implications for how well the resulting product works, how long it lasts, its effects on the areas where resources for the product are extracted, and the environmental consequences of the product's ultimate disposal or recyclability. In my book, Aluminum Upcycled: Sustainable Design in Historical Perspective, I examine ways in which industrial producers such as Herman Miller, who make furniture, and the Ford Motor Company with pickup trucks are successfully using scrap aluminum to make mass-produced goods of elevated economic value. Upcycling is when we take materials and turn them into more durable, more functional, and more economically coveted products. These are two such cases currently happening where that is the case. This is not the only sustainable design strategy involving aluminum. Design for recycling standards, meaning the ability to disassemble a product and extract the recyclables from it easily, mean that the disassembly of products such as the aluminum encased Apple MacBook Pro can be done quickly and efficiently, thus leading to higher recycling rates from complex manufactured goods. Aluminum represents a success story for upcycling, as aluminum is a material with a very high recovery rate and widespread applications, from everything from beer cans to jumbo jet airplanes. Materials scientists estimate that more than 2/3 of all of the aluminum produced worldwide since 1900 remains in use today. That's a tremendous success story for an industrial raw material. However, the recycling of aluminum does not represent a perfectly circular economy. In the last half century, recycling rates throughout the industrialized world have been very high, especially after the establishment of municipal collection programs adopted in the wake of Keep America Beautiful's campaign to present recycling as the burden of individuals and communities rather than on the manufacturers of disposable products. Tens of thousands of communities have recycling programs today. Pretty much all of those programs pick up aluminum because it's such a profitable material on scrap markets. However, in the last 50 years, as industrial society has succeeded in recycling more than 70% of all aluminum consumed, the extraction of bauxite worldwide to make virgin aluminum has more than tripled. Despite demand for scrap aluminum, and despite design standards that prioritize the use of recycled materials in manufacturing, bauxite mines around the world from West Africa to North Australia are producing more intensively the raw materials needed for new aluminum than ever before. And this mining threatens groundwater, crops, wildlife habitat, and the health and safety of miners. The demands of industrialized capitalism continue to drive extraction, even of this most recyclable of resources. The history of aluminum recycling in this context is not so much a closed circular loop. Rather, recycling is one facet of a growing spiral of primary and secondary materials combined to feed production in the expanding destructive path of industrial capitalism. The recurring theme in this history is one of ostensibly sustainable practices feeding industrial capitalism. I will conclude with a local dimension of this pattern. In the last year, my colleagues and I published an environmental history of New York City, written in the context of Michael Bloomberg's administration promoting both sustainability and gentrification. Thinking about how systems of production, consumption, and waste shape modern society is one focus of this book. We discuss the ways that waste management practices have shaped New York, including the ways in which recent real estate developers have claimed to clean up the city by turning one-time industrial and working-class residential areas into gentrified places close to Wall Street on the train lines that are clean, safe, and attractive for multimillionaires to purchase condominiums with 7- and 8-figure price tags. The lands surrounding the Newtown Creek waterway that borders Queens and Brooklyn are no exception to this pattern. These neighborhoods have long histories of immigrant and working class communities, and they're also neighborhoods that have historically been the local centers of scrap recycling businesses. Now they see gleaming glass towers rise in their midst, threatening to push out the laborers who do the work of managing the city's discards. What this means for the economy of local scrap recycling in the future is an open question. But the history of so-called nuisance industries such as scrap points to likely attempts to force them to relocate outside of the city limits, perhaps out of state to New Jersey. This would follow the out of sight, out of mind trucking of solid waste from New York City every day to landfills in Pennsylvania and Virginia, which follows a trend that over the last 30 years have seen New Yorkers increasingly intolerant of managing wastes produced in the city within the local borders. These are just some ways in which environmental history cautions us that the successes of the circular economy come with limits, and ostensibly sustainable product design and land use decisions can continue to feed the damaging practices that hurt people and places both locally and globally. Thank you very much.
All right. Sorry, I momentarily lost the Zoom window. Okay, so thank you to Carl Zimring for sending in his recorded talk. And I thought we could move now into the conversation. And I want to invite everybody who's here to please feel free to, if you would like to raise your hand to ask a question or give some sort of response in any way. A response and or comment and not only question is would be wonderful as well. Or also if people want to put thoughts or questions in the chat. And really I have some different responses or questions, but really want to encourage everybody, also especially from the afternoon panel, to sort of have a cross conversation across the day. So I thought one way to just get started is to think about mapping in the first three presentations that we saw. And I want to actually also just say that with Carl Zimring's work, one reason I thought it would be interesting to place in method and engagements is because he's speaking about written work. And I think here, we have a range of ways to engage, a range of methods. And I thought it was important to have, texts and written work be part of our consideration of a potential method to respond to these histories of extraction and also look to reparative acts. So with that said, moving back to the question of mapping, I wondered maybe Jeffrey and Scott, Jerrod and Galen, if you want to just each maybe reflect a bit more on mapping as a response to extraction, and also mapping as a method. And here I'm thinking of the mapping in relation to Weeksville, also thinking about mapping in relation to redlining, and what mapping a sort of potential as a response to the destructive policies of redlining. And then Galen, of course, your project mapping and also the different sort of technologies, different forms of data that you have used and different representational strategies of mapping and same different representational strategies. Like, do you see for the Weeksville project, do you see the collage as a form of mapping? So we could start there. Maybe Jeffrey and Scott, if you want to reflect on mapping.
It's an interesting conversation. I'm going to be extremely candid at some level. Hopefully Jeffrey entertains this as well. Probably 10 minutes before this presentation, we had the discussion about which slides to present of the student work, and the discussion of mapping and collage as parallel presentation modes, and kind of analytic modes, right? Because many times people don't see collage as an analytic tool necessarily, and strictly see mapping as purely analytic. So, so we look to, in a way, blur those conditions, or hopefully at least present them as equal types of modes in which students start to work, in which we work as spatial thinkers, and that the collage offers a kind of human scale and humanness, and the ability to present and represent the human condition in a way that maps cannot do at all. They abstract it so much that you don't even know if people are there. And so, again, really mapping is an extremely important part of this ethnography, because it is part of that archive that is missing from the kind of historic history of people in the United States that we're looking at. And so, you know, to do that mapping is required for the collage work even.
Yes, I think I can make another observation about that, the mapping in our project. When we began the project, we actually worked with a really intensive archive of historic maps of Weeksville, locating the Lenape spaces, the slave plantation, and then the urban grid that was introduced in the 1860s, and created some really interesting maps with our students showing that history. And then, of course, later when we began to look at displacement of urban renewal, we began to look at the NYCHA housing blocks that were built in the Weeksville area and what happened to those houses. And we're actually currently interviewing a person who was alive when the Weeksville houses were destroyed to build some of the NYCHA projects. So we're really interested in recuperating that history of what the historic area. And then when we got into the actual archiving and interviewing of the individual subjects, the students who were 4th and 5th year architecture students who had been trained to look at things very abstractly were really amazed by the power of the oral history and the critical ethnography and the actual stories that they were hearing from the places that they'd only seen abstractly. I mean, it was really eye-opening for them to understand that there were these rhizomatic relationships that just couldn't be mapped in a conventional map. And then, of course, that ties in with what Scott's saying about the collage, which actually cuts space, which is why the collage was invented, you know, or perfected in the early 20th century, the modernist device. And collage was very important for us in teaching. We had to go through many iterations of collages to get to the ones that we saw today, because the students also weren't trained to work in collage as architects. So that was a real exciting discovery for us in working with the Weeksville area. And we're working with ideas of psychogeography for the Weeksville residents. Right now, we've created a format to help them to map their own neighborhoods, because we're really working at a micro scale compared to most of the macro projects that we saw today of just on the ground. Albany Avenue, Atlantic Avenue, you know, what happens here today, right now, in this historiography that we're creating. So thank you, very good question.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Yeah, I don't have a ton to add. I mean, I think that's kind of my feeling about mapping. I mean, I would just say, like, an anecdote, you know, it's interesting, you know, when we teach students to use GIS. I mean, there's this sort of fascinating progression. I think it's fascinating. It's kind of, it alternates. Sometimes it's kind of depressing, actually, but there's this sort of progression of seeing it as this kind of all-seeing eye, you know, like, oh, there's so many sources of data. There's so much stuff on the internet, you know, like you can find the road maps of any country in the world, and it's all sort of like available to you for free. But then as soon as you start digging into it and you realize, well, essentially you're just plugging a spreadsheet into a like visualizing tool, and anybody can put that data in there. Then I think you see students start to make the jump of the map is not a document. I think the map is like actually kind of an argument. I mean, and when I say map, I mean in the sense of like how it's used in an architectural educational setting. I mean, obviously the sort of flip side of this, right, is the sort of map as the policy, which is like the redlining and, like, you know, the ways that these things are sort of, you know, demised basically based on no sort of on the ground introspection but regardless, I mean, the point remains, right? These are sort of always political with a lowercase p, right? They're made to do something, and they're drawings to either enact a policy or prove a point or document something from a different perspective. So I think, you know, I totally agree. I mean, I think the collage is kind of the interpretation, and you know, and a really powerful one at that, because it's kind of, in a way, I would say it's almost the same as, like, I mean, the way that we currently make maps with like GIS and stuff. I mean, it is a collage, a GIS map. It's taking data from different sources, putting them on top of each other, generating a sort of set of like either explicit or implied relationships and causalities. But I think just to sort of say, like, I think the sort of pedagogical aim of working at this scale, especially with, architects, people who are familiar with maps, but maybe not map making, is sort of conveying that point that, this is no different than, a diagram that you might use to try and convince a client that doing a building this way versus that way is correct or better or favorable. I mean, it's never neutral.
Yes, that's right. It's never neutral. It's a colonial project, map making. And one of the things we realized in working with Kevin Lynch's image of the city, which was essential for us to work with, we tried to decolonize it by pairing it with Mindy Fullalove's root shock and really looking at areas of displacement, because some of Lynch's assumptions are not assumptions we'd want to make today about neighborhoods. And yet his method is very sound in a lot of ways and essential for the students to know. So it was nice to be able to interrogate maps that way.
Yeah, I mean, as Laura mentioned, redlining was a mapping system to decide where investment could or couldn't happen. So that was a negative example. Decades later, they created this policy called the Community Reinvestment Act that said that banks had to invest in communities that they have banking branches. So one of the silver lining is it encouraged banks to invest in affordable housing. So lots of banks invest specifically because they're enforced by the law. So, this is, creating equity, right? So even today, that still is in place. So Chase Bank, PNC Bank, they have to invest in certain areas that have been designed. If you think of that chart that I put up that put equality versus equity, they're saying, no, don't just invest everywhere. There are certain areas that for a period of time were strategically uninvested or disinvested. And that we could use very thoughtful ways to help lift up communities that may not have had proper support at some point in time so that they can become viable communities, just like all the other communities. I think a not so great recent example is the opportunity zones, where people use maps to decide where would get economic improvement. It was.
Oh, we dropped out your mic.
But the general idea is that it was thoughtfully, pinpointed. Where should we encourage development? Where should we encourage business investment in communities that historically did not receive it?
Yeah, I think it would be really, I think maybe just picking up on the colonial here in relation to the map. Of course, because maps are, they're documents that are, revealing or making visible boundaries. And what I found fascinating was the way in which boundaries, came up in each of these talks, and different sorts of power structures, relationships, like relationships to the federal government, neighborhoods and the federal government with NYCHA, the relationship Weeksville, and the neighborhood, Galen with your project, the bounded, the island as a space, as a space, confined by the geological, by its location amidst the ocean, and so I think. Again, going back to this question of method, and maybe, we can expand out beyond the map, but thinking about, the sort of decolonizing, Jeffrey, you had mentioned, Jeffrey and Scott, you had mentioned that in your presentation, as a method. And maybe if you also each just want to speak a bit more about sort of the colonial, I know this is a huge question, but and responding to colonial histories, I would say both actually colonial and neo-colonial in these projects. So it's a very large question, but if you each want to respond to that as well in any way.
Well, what we're interested in doing in decolonizing certain texts, as you mentioned with Lynch's texts, is to interrogate them, and find out what works and what doesn't work. And I had the advantage of learning how to read Plato as a student at Berkeley, looking for colonial or slave owning, relationships in the text. So I think there's a way in which in architecture schools we can really interrogate the texts that we're asked to use that are foundational, like the Lynch's texts, by pairing them with other texts that will challenge some of their assumptions. And so that's what we're really interested in doing, to move the decolonizing relationship, and to also work, a decolonial studio is one that works, with student voices being primary rather than secondary, and working with a student-centered studio where we're really interested in following what the students want, which is a shift in architectural education from the hierarchical method of the past, and understanding at the same time that there are certain logics of representation that they want their projects to be understood by across all studios. So it's a big question, and obviously one that we could have a whole other panel on. Right. But it's something we talk about a lot.
Yeah, and I think we also address decolonizing the map, which again is one of the primary goals of the work we've done with Studio in particular, but the archive itself and engaging a living archive, one that is starting now, let's say, for the future, and recording the histories of people who reside in the space now, is a part of that decolonization, right? To really say that the people who inhabit the space and use the space are the one that we hear their voice. And then we begin to translate and make graphic and physical those stories, right? And so, and then those stories are both a projection to the past of memories, which have, changed over time, right? Something that you thought was commonplace at one point in your life has now become romanticized possibly, or understood as something that is essential and, primary to a person's current reading of their space and place. But then also it starts to speak to projecting to the future as well. Our methodology of engaging the archive and the auditory archive in particular is to just put in front of the people who live there the prompt of place. Let us talk about the place you live and have lived. And once they begin to reflect on it again, it starts to open up an entire new way in which many people haven't spoken about their place as a focal kind of interest. And so that again introduces a new player to development, future development, and what can be and what might happen to a place.
It's a lot of different things I'm thinking about when you pose this question, Laura. I guess the ones off the top of my head is, we're working on a research project right now in a local NYCHA community in East Harlem. And one of the young men mentioned that they don't go to other campuses that are like blocks away from them, that each of these public housing projects become this little kingdom, that it's like your safety net, but your danger field is like around you, and that you can't go to the other kingdoms. And this kind of idea of colonialism of that you got to keep them separate because as a collective, right, you can't control them. And that these public housing communities were not meant to be for enjoyment. They weren't meant for, for you to be your launching pad. They were kind of a holding situation. And this idea that how can we make communities more connected? How can we empower young people? They feel like, yes, I can go meet with other young people like me in neighborhoods next to me. Together we can, do things in not only arts, not only you go play ball together, but also start a business together. We have a similar experience. We're in one of the largest cities in the country. And we have all these little miniature kingdoms. There's a running joke in New York City about the Harlem versus Brooklyn beef, which is kind of a running joke. But it's actually like people in Harlem are like afraid of people in Brooklyn and vice versa. So this kind of idea that like they're different, I should be afraid of them, goes back to the colonialism thing of keeping us separate. Even in the Latino community, it's a big problem now, today. Colorism is a problem that kind of dates back to colonialism, and that it kind of finds its way into where people live and where people interact. I think us as designers, as creators of communities, we have to be thoughtful about that as we kind of go forward. How can we mend that, right? How can we repair communities that have had decades of damage? How can we improve that situation? I see two questions that sprouted up, Laura.
Yeah, maybe Galen, if you want to add your thoughts, and then we'll move to Jerrod, and then Jayna. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think picking up on what Jerrod was just saying, like, I think what has been like educational about the work in Singapore is sort of the way that consumption and the sort of extractive industry of sand and just anything that's related with building Singapore has sort of created this kind of, like, I would say, soft colonialism. I mean, Singapore does not have colonies, but it definitely has impact in the region. And that kind of flows in a couple of different ways. I mean, one of the anecdotes I didn't have time to share is about different ways people in Vietnam and Cambodia have actually tried to track the cargo ships that actually move the sand from the river deltas to Singapore. Me here in my apartment or in Singapore itself, I have access to ship tracking data. These folks did not. They had to actually follow the cargo ships, in this case from Vietnam all the way to Singapore, which is like a very, very far distance, just to ascertain that this one individual cargo ship was actually carrying sand. And they had to observe it the whole way. They had to see the little boats go up the river, go to the big boat, follow the big boat, right? And it's like, I think what I suppose is sort of a downfall of mapping as a representational technique, if that's the only way you're looking at it, is that, it's one thing to sort of draw an arrow and say, yeah, this came from here and went there. But I think there's this sort of granularity that's missing in that sense today. I mean, there are so many disparate parts of the Singaporean construction industry that are from elsewhere outside of Singapore. I mean, the workers themselves are kind of, you want to say imported. I don't think that would be an exaggeration. So I think what's sort of striking to me about the sort of ways in which the Singaporean project is the colonial project is the fact that it is so dispersed, and it's so hard to track backwards with any sense of scale, because the sort of data itself is actually also kind of collected in, shall we say, developed parts of the world as well. So you can kind of talk with a high grain of detail about sites, today in New York City or Singapore, but sort of doing the work of kind of figuring out how things came to be that way, or how they might move forward. I mean, it's really kind of difficult, and it needs a very holistic approach. You can't just find a map or a document, especially not now. So.
Yeah, and that's a really incredible story about the sort of tracking of sand, because it is so hard, with cargo ships like come into ports. So much of that is actually unknown. It's not. You know, it it we don't know what is in those those cargo ships.
Right.
So yeah, really fascinating. I want to turn to Jerrod Rice, who has a question. Jerrod, who's a student here at Pratt, who I really enjoyed working with this semester on the lecture series, and he runs Pratt Futures in the School of Architecture. Yeah, Jerrod.
Thank you, Laura. I just want to take a second just to thank everyone speaking. Even works that I've seen and participated on before, seeing them in new lights continuously, and the new projects that I'm seeing, it's exciting to see everything going on. But well, definitely not. But one of the things I was noticing a lot was, and when we're talking about architectural representation and utilizing it, most times we see it as somewhat of a squishing of the past to be visible and trying to render a lot of slow violences and things that aren't visible. And it's an interesting conversation to see how we can do that without upholding and promoting colonizing ideas of mapping and top down. And we just talked about that, but one question I was wondering was, how can we turn these somewhat into tools of activation and prospective, trying, I suppose, where to go and how to, I suppose, mobilize without doing that within a colonizing framework, like not being a top down, not trying to say, this is where we need to go. How do we engage in these projects? How do we really try and push an idea we have without joining that? How does, I suppose, local participant interaction come into play? And I would be interested to see, I mean, I know a little bit, Scott and Jeffrey, the plan, but, seeing how that's progressed there. And also with the Singapore, like how that's such a large, it feels very large scale. Is there some kind of prospective way to go forward that might involve some kind of local, or I suppose, what's the best way of doing that? I hope that question is clear, but yeah.
Well, I'll try to field some of it. And thank you for the question, Jerrod. Jerrod was one of our research associates on the inauguration of the Weeksville Archive. And so, as he said, he's familiar with that. I'm a root worker, root work in the hoodoo tradition, let's say, in the African-American community. And in that community, one might look at herbs and other types of natural materials, both as they're just neutral. So they are positive and or negative. It depends on the user, and then also amount. And so when we ask the question about the maps and how can maps necessarily be used for positive tools, I think it's exactly what we're trying to do, is say, put those tools, make them critical tools for the common person, and for the people who live in the spaces that developers are preying upon, right? And so that those same tools can now also be used to put forward your personal development. And so again, not necessarily seeing them as something that's to run away from, but something to add to. So similar to, as we talk about critical race theory today, that it is not against history, it's adding more information to history because we know more, right? And so this is the same thing. Let's look at these tools that we might have, be them map or collage, and use them to the needs that we have. In that sense.
Yeah, I don't, it's a really good question, Jerrod, thank you. I mean, I would say I have two sort of answers. I mean, on the one hand, there's the sort of activist groups that are organizing in Southeast Asia against specific acts of extraction, specific sites. One example I would point to, a colleague and friend of mine, Will Jameson, published recently an account of how in Cambodia they got their sand ban passed, which basically was a lot of local pressure, a lot of people in a specific province around a specific delta doing a lot of work to basically embarrass the Cambodian government into sort of stopping, at least for a time. And so I can post that in the chat, but it's, so that on the one hand is sort of like dealing with the sort of extraction aspect. I mean, the thing that I think about as far as like on the architectural scale, like of a building, you know, obviously I was happy that Lacaton and Basal won the Pritzker this year from a sort of material economy perspective. I think that's a good thing. But I think it can't just be sort of adaptive reuse. I think there's a sort of client aspect to building a specific building when you're talking about what materials you're using, where you're sourcing things from. You know, those kind of decisions, I think the sort of issue with being an architect is those decisions are rarely yours to make in a vacuum. You do kind of have to be collaborative. And so I think what I see as an opportunity is that architects in practice have to be collaborative in the first place. So collaboration, very broadly speaking, is not something that they're unaware of or unfamiliar with. The question is sort of how do we take and expand the sort of the output of an architectural office, let's say like the drawing set, and use it maybe not just to describe a sort of particular built condition, but maybe like the context of that built condition, or the reasoning behind why a certain material was chosen or a certain aspect of the building was kept. And this gets to what Scott was just saying too, because then that opens up questions about, you know, it's sort of like intertwining an ecological and I would say a sort of decolonial perspective, because if you have to keep more buildings, you have to understand more about where those buildings have come from and why they've remained where they've remained, and you know why people might not want them to stay there. Like to me, it seems like these two things kind of reinforce each other. Again, speaking at the scale of like a building, but yeah, it's a really fascinating question, and I don't know that I can say much else other than it's that's like I think what's ahead of us now for the next you know, for the foreseeable future.
Thank you. I'm excited to see I suppose how it progresses. And if you could drop that link that you mentioned, that would be great. I just love to see it. But again, thank you.
I'd like to add to that as well. As an educator, I am biased, but I'm a big believer in education. We can inform and empower people in communities that they learn how to do these things, how they can use these tools. You know, young community activists, block associations, local city council members who can influence the impact of the change in their communities. You know, if in New York City, community boards are really powerful in the change in their communities. We as designers, you know, we can educate and inform people. Here's historical precedents. Here's things that went well. Here's things that didn't go well, right? And hopefully with the right amount of information, they can make good decisions going forward. So I think that's the way we can not only just come in with all the ideas and all the knowledge, but like, no, let's have an exchange of knowledge. Let's have a conversation and then, you know, empower people to be able to make decisions that impact their communities.
Thank you all so much. Jayna, I see your hand has been raised for a while, and really looking forward to Jayna Brown's presentation this afternoon on the afternoon panel. Oh.
Hi, yeah, there we go. Thank you for this conversation. I've learned so much and it's been very helpful in some of what I've been thinking about. And thank you for talking about, we're thinking together about decolonizing maps, in gesturing to mapping as a form of knowledge production, ways of knowing that are based, right, in the ways that we understand maps now, in mastery, thinking about how humans are inhabiting space and relating to larger ecologies. So my question is really, how do we do that? How do we think about inhabiting space, this space differently? Still thinking about, thinking locally, but also thinking expansively, thinking globally, not for an eye as to what to extract, right? But still being planetary. So letting go of this sort of political map of nations. And like Galen said, the granularity, but also planetary, right? And part of that, I'm thinking about movement, right? Movement between places. That's very vivid for me. This the barge with the sand on it, right? I'm not an architect, so, but the sand for me, that's been really concrete, so to speak. So, yeah. Any words on that from anybody?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can maybe speak a bit to the sand aspect. I mean, this was a sort of a frustration of mine in the early phases of the project. Is I found myself actually running into a lot of people in Singapore who are super helpful, but were very dismissive of the project because it wasn't, let's say, about, it didn't have that specificity. It wasn't about saying I can trace all of the sand used in this like massive landmass back to a single source, right? And or at least not with not with something that would withstand like peer review or something like that. And to me, I guess this gets down to sort of the importance of maybe storytelling as opposed to sort of data collection these days. And I think the link, I would say also, just to shout out to Will again, but the link I shared, his story, and I think he had a collaborator on that. So their story of linking Cambodia to Singapore through this network of extraction, I think is kind of the way that things have to be done now. I mean, I feel like there are good data-oriented design practices, of course, and I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, but I think we have to start asking the question of who the audience is and what their sort of capability to kind of get into our heads as kind of academic-oriented designers, architects, what have you. So I mean, that's kind of why I landed on this level of everything has to be drawn, because that's a thing that you can hand to somebody who is kind of like a random person on the street even, right? And it has to be sort of about a narrative, because I think there's value in pursuing hard data, but there's also value in just sort of like the scale of how things are diffused around the globe right now. And we see this now with like lithium mining. I mean, there's a bunch of really fascinating projects about how those land rights are contested and who the players are. So I think there's something there, and maybe it's some sort of like global, like somebody early on brought up to me that like you can, when you buy tuna cans, it says like, oh, this was like sustainably caught or not sustainably caught. And there's like a sort of global marking system that sort of establishes some kind of, I don't know, quality about a product. And it sort of occurs to me that maybe that's sort of partially what's ahead of us in the building trades, is sort of trying to figure out how do you, an architect or an engineer or whoever, speak to somebody who is your client and may not have anything to do with architecture at all. This may be their first building, they may not know anything about it, they may just know that they want a thing, and sort of present it to them not just on an aesthetic grounds, but also on a sort of like ethical consumption kind of ground. Again, that's why I mentioned lacton and basalt. I think that the ethos of not building unless you absolutely have to is a super valuable one. But it's not just ecologically valuable. I think it's also like professionally valuable, because then you have to sort of have that conversation with the client about like what's good about what exists, and maybe like where it came from and what it took to get it there. but also like, okay, so what do we really need to do, and where can we source the new stuff from that will be sort of in line with how you're trying to use it. So yeah, I mean, I hope that kind of answered some of it.
Or maybe thinking about what sourcing means, right?
Mhm.
Like
Mhm.
learning how to build things in different ways. That there are other epistemes of building, but also, but data is narrative too, isn't it? I mean, there's always a narrative, right?
Mhm.
So I wonder about you know, not reducing it to sort of like you know, traditional old ways of understanding, you know, and then the modern ways, you know, but like how to kind of dissolve that distinction.
Yeah, I would say, especially as we talk, I love this fact that you said that data is also narrative, because it's narrative in a sense that there are certain data that is collected and certain data that is not collected. And this is where the narrative begins, right? What is excluded as far as the information that you put on the table, and therefore you're starting to construct a kind of worldview or view within this framework that you've constructed. And so I think that's a human condition, right? That's something that it's almost impossible for us to escape as humans. But where we can compensate for that is in this in the struggle that we're working towards now, diversity, right? Diversification, making sure that there are multiple voices at any given kinds of you know, situation. And so which constituencies are coming to the table, and what knowledge and abilities do they have? And that's, again, this idea of kind of empowering the kind of average person and communities, but also working as agents for those people. So maybe everyone's not going to become a map maker and a geographer and an architect and things of that nature, but we do need to have architects and spatial thinkers who are invested in those communities and for the common person. You know, so I also love an aspect of your question that speaks to aspiration beyond just the local, right? That it's something that expands regionally, that expands, you know, across globally, and it also expands across time. And that, again, is part of the work that we're trying to enact is that, you know, in the communities we're working in, it is very often thought of as very small windows of time in which people inhabit these spaces. Because let's say you live in a NYCHA housing, some people, you know, that's supposed to be transitory. But as our research has shown, we have generations of people who have lived in, you know, housing developments. And that was supposed to be something that was just to move you from poverty to the kind of middle class and things of that nature. And to bring forward that knowledge to a community that you have been invested here as a people, as a for a long time, and that by de facto, if not by official decree, de facto, these spaces and places are you are a steward of those places. You can be a steward of those locations. And so I love this tracking that the Vietnamese and Cambodians did of like, hey, what are these people doing? Taking sand from here to there, and where are they going? Where are they taking it? And why is it off my shore as opposed to off your shore that you're extracting this stuff? Why do you, and so, you know, again, I think that was an act of tracking is mapping, right? It's the first act of mapping, right? You have to begin to see what the terrain is, survey, and things of that nature. And so this discussion of mapping, I think, is very, very important, especially for us as spatial thinkers, you know, because it does start to opened the door to an entire way of philosophizing, thinking, and politicizing, right? I would say that one of the primary political acts is placemaking, and that placemaking happens over the kind of two-dimensional drawing of, okay, what's ours, what's inside, what belongs to us, and what's outside of us. And so it's a P, I think Galen said P with a little p. I think it's a P with a big P, capital P. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think actually we can close this really really wonderful conversation in the interest of having 12 minutes of break. Since there's not a lot of breaks in the schedule. So we will return, we'll just leave the Zoom running, of course, but start again at 11:30 with Kiel Moe's keynote, and then a response from Galen Pardee, and again, open to questions. Thank you again, everybody. And I think also these questions of narrative, just so much of what has been discussed, we will return again to in the afternoon. So please stretch your legs, do whatever during the break, and we'll see everybody at 11:30.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Do it.